tout le monde. Welcome to another edition of Battlefield Tours. We're very pleased once again to have the expertise of Rob Woolsey this evening, and he's going to be speaking to you about breaking through the Hindenburg Line. So, Rob, thank you for being here again this evening.
So good evening, everyone. My name is Rob Woolsey. I'm a member of the Guild of Battlefield Guides, and today we're going to be talking about two very important battles in Canadian history, the breaking through of the Hindenburg Line, the Battle of the Canal du Nord, and the Battle of Cambrai in 1918. And I have to put Battle of Cambrai in 1918 because many people will think that we're talking about the 1917 tank battle, and we're not talking about tanks tonight. So, MFS Europe is not affiliated, doesn't endorse, doesn't sponsor any of the companies or places I'm talking about. These are places that I recommend that you use from my experience on the battlefields and my time in and around them. There are areas that give you and places that give you the best places to stay and eat and do things when you're visiting the battlefields here. So what we're going to be talking about tonight, some recommended preparations, visas, some helpful words and hints, some must-eat foods and treats, best places to stay, transportation. Then we're going to talk about the actual battle itself. We're going to talk about, firstly, the battle of, we'll give you an overview of the Battle of the Canal du Nord and Cambrai, using the map of the official history of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Then I'm going to talk about the Battle of the Canal du Nord, which took place from the 27th of November to the 3rd of October, 1918. And then we're going to talk about the Battle of Cambrai from 8 to 10 October, 1918. And this battle will bring us right to the last month of the war. So this is an actual airplane attacking in support of the Canadians on the Canal du Nord attack. So it's over the canal. It's remarkable. It's an action photo. But you'll notice that there's fence posts everywhere. It doesn't look all shattered and like you would see on the Somme and other battlefields. And that's because where this photo is taken is a war maneuver. So this is a very big difference. This period of the war is more about open mobility, which is a nice change for the Canadian soldiers fighting. So what are we talking about? We are talking about, in fact, France in the region of the Nord and Hauts-de-France. It's a population of around 31,000 people. Of course, they speak French. The closest international airport is Paris Charles de Gaulle, although there are airports, local airports and regional airports around. Located on the Scheldt River or the Escaut River, this place has existed since Roman times. The Duke of Wellington actually had his headquarters in Cambrai from 1815 till 1818 after the Napoleonic Wars. And it was a major transportation hub for the Germans who occupied the town from 1914 to 1918. And it suffered heavy damage and was bombed and partially wrecked a second time during the Second World War. Cool fact about Cambrai and the area we're talking about, it's the first mass use of tanks took place in the First Battle of Cambrai, 20th of November to the 7th of December 1917, with a total of 476 being used. It also happens to have its own memorial to the missing. So, recommended preparations. This Pas-de-Calais in the Nord area, it's actually on the border of the two, has generally a mild climate with wet, cool winters and a warm, dry summer. Best time to travel really is the end of April to the middle of November. That's when it's not very muddy. I visited this area in March. It was quite muddy, and the farmers were just plowing the field, so there was lots of war remains coming to the surface. But it's best to travel when it's drier. It's much safer and it is much easier on your vehicle and your clothing. Always bring a rain jacket. It is always a good idea. When you travel with me, I often get rained on. It also helps break the wind as well. And you really do need good footwear because some of the sites you're going to be seeing in this tour, you have to walk into. You can't get your car super close to. And some of them are quite, not challenging, but you want good footwear, not flip-flops. Always travel with medical insurance. I always recommend it. You never know what can go wrong. All the memorials and cemeteries in most places in this area are child-friendly. I've never found one that isn't. That doesn't mean they don't exist. There's a city pass for Arras, but there is no city passes for Cambrai. So always look to the travel advisories from the Government of Canada. France is relatively safe. Petty crime is a risk, but generally this region is quite safe. France is always a risk of terrorism, but it's very low in this region. There's no COVID restrictions. The visa requirements, there's none from the EU, and it's a maximum 90-day stay from Canada. There is a hospital in Arras and in Cambrai. 112 is your emergency number, and the only embassy or consulate in France is in Paris. So if you have problems, that's where you have to contact. So always dress for the weather. Very, very important. It's not far from the sea. It can also get really quite chilly because the wind comes ripping through there. It's a lot of open fields and not a lot of forests. Please don't climb on any of the monuments. That's exactly what they are. They're monuments to either individuals, the fallen, or units that fought there. And they are considered quite important to the locals and to the members of those units. There are bunkers and things in this area. The picture on the top left, in fact, is in the middle of a farmer's field. It's actually the German front line for part of the previous attack. And you don't want to climb on that. It could be risky because there's artillery shells and all sorts of dangerous things around. Please remember, when you're visiting the battlefields, you're visiting someone's home. They live, work, and to keep visiting these areas, please respect their property, their parking, and things like that. They really are quite sensitive to that. And always be careful of war remains. Don't touch anything that resembles an artillery shell, a grenade, anything like that. They're becoming more and more unstable as time progresses. And in fact, a lot of the ones these days that are coming to the surface are a lot of the chemical shells. And so they're exceptionally dangerous. And on this battlefield, mustard gas was used quite heavily. And mustard gas is not a gas, it's actually an oily liquid that will burn your skin and hurt you quite badly. And so how easy this is, I said the top one was at a bunker I was touring with, and it was really cool. We found the two bunkers, and there was an artillery shell right on top, so I had to shoo the people away. And the bottom one is the one I basically parked on last summer, which is never very smart to do with my truck when I was touring somebody, because I pulled over and I thought it was safe and I didn't even see it. And that's a 4.5-inch howitzer shell, which is a very large piece of kaboom. So just be careful around war remains. They are very dangerous. So must try places to eat. So there's two real places you can stay for this tour. One is Arras, which is the bigger of the two places. It's got great resources. It's got a train station, great public transit. It has all sorts of amenities that you would like to have. One of my favorite restaurants in all of France is Le Comptoir in Arras, between the Grand Place and the Place des Héros. And right beside it happens to be Le Capsule, which, if you are a beer drinker, has all sorts of great local beers, somewhere in the range of 80 or 90. It's fabulous. It's really cool, but there's lots in that area. The other place you could choose to stay is actually in the town of Cambrai itself. I've never actually stayed there. I have eaten there. Chez B and Dan in Cambrai is excellent, great local food. And the other, of course, is Olivier. It's a nice little restaurant. It's a mix of French and North African cuisine there. But there is lots to do and eat in Cambrai. I just have never really used it because it hasn't been convenient for buses. So where should you stay? If you're staying in Arras, for me, my recommendation, of course, is the Holiday Inn Express Arras. It's the closest to the train station. It offers a great breakfast. It has parking. It's an amazingly clean hotel. I have used it probably 30 times, and I would go back to it again. The Ace Hotel in Arras, less conveniently located, less amenities near it, but it is actually just off the Arras-Cambrai road, so it can be a little bit easier to transit to and from the battlefields. If you choose to stay in Cambrai, there's a B&B hotel, which is highly recommended to me from some guides, and the Ibis Hotel in Cambrai. One of the guides actually did mention the Original City Tab Hotel in Cambrai. He said it was quite good and it was workable. But Ibis Hotel chain is quite good. I've used them in Albert, and I've used B&B as for personal stuff, so they're always quite good hotels to stay at. Oh, my apologies. That just went. There we go. So ride services, they're only traditional taxis in Arras and Cambrai. There's no Uber or anything like that as of yet. There are many battlefield tour guide companies in Arras, and you can find them online. I always recommend the Guild of Battlefield Guides that I belong to, or you can contact me through my Facebook group, Woolsey's War Walks, and I specialize in Canadian battlefield touring. So now to get to the good stuff. The Battle of Cambrai, the Canal du Nord and Cambrai, from the 27th of September to the 11th of October, 1918. So this is the pause between the previous battle, the Battle of Arras 1918, so Battle of the Scarpe and the Battle of the Drocourt-Queant line, ends when the Germans pull back across the Canal du Nord on the 4th and 5th of September, 1918. And The Canal du Nord, it was a waterway that was incomplete at the beginning of the First World War, and the Germans built it into their now Hindenburg defensive line. So when the Canadian Corps reached it on the night of the 4th and the 5th of September, it began for them a period of reorganization, refitting, and resting, as the canal itself was a formidable obstacle that required a dedicated, well thought out plan to breach. The Germans on the far side of the bank held the high ground. It was well wired, and of course, part of the canal was filled with water. Part of it was flooded areas around the canal, and the Germans had built bunkers and trenches around it. The Germans, of course, could not counterattack because they could not counterattack the Canadians because they had blown all the bridges across the canal itself. And so they were trapped on one side and the Canadians on the other. So as the Canadians occupied the ground, they began to reverse the captured German trenches and create a line of defenses to hold on to this newly won ground. This quiet period still cost Canada and its troops on the front line about 100 casualties a day. And this was mostly due to German artillery bombardment and machine gun fire trying to keep the Canadians away. Lieutenant General Arthur Currie, the Canadian Corps commander, ordered his troops to pull back a small distance on the 16th of September to get them out from under the machine gun fire from the east bank, but it still controlled the approaches to the canal. This next plan, as I said, required a deliberate plan. The Canal du Nord, while incomplete and integrated into the Hindenburg Line, had all sorts of challenges. Large areas around it were still swamps, but the section between the village of Sains-le-Marquion and Manœuvre, 4,000 yards wide, roughly, was dry, making it the best possible location to launch the attack from. This area, though, was heavily wired by the Germans, and they had placed many machine guns to cover this area. But the trenches here were not as prepared as they were in other locations, and it was possible, from the reconnaissance and the aerial photography, the Canadians thought, to overcome them with artillery. Further back from this line, about a mile, was the second line called the Marquion Line, which ran parallel to the canal, and it too was heavily wired and ran from the eastern edge of the village of Marquion south to the Bapaume-Cambrai Road. The village of Marquion on this map is actually on the Arras-Cambrai Road, and you can actually still cross the Canal du Nord there. And that was a major obstacle for the Canadians. And of course, this line, the Marquion Line, was dominated by another position about a mile back called Bourlon Wood, a forest on another hill about a mile behind this line and south of the village of Bourlon. But it was hard to know what was in and around Bourlon, as it was still thick with trees and foliage. In fact, just like the Battle of Arras, this was really open country and not destroyed by shell fire at all. In fact, there had been almost no fighting in this area over the past 4 years. Grass and trees were common, and you'll see that in many period photos. This map here shows you the entire battle from the crossing of the Canal du Nord till the very, very end of this action. And it is a big battle. So, the Battle of the Canal du Nord. The Battle of the Canal du Nord was the first part of the operation to break through the Hindenburg Line. Its objectives were to force a crossing of the canal, capture Bourlon Wood, and a high ground feature near a place called Pilgrim's Rest, and a farm on the Arras-Cambrai Road called La Maison Neuve. Because the section of the Canal du Nord north of Sains-le-Marquion was flooded or filled with water, the Canadian Corps had requested and received an extension to their front line south of this by 2,600 yards to include the dry section in front of the village named Inchy-en-Artois. This meant that they were crowded into an area between the villages of Inchy and the Arras-Cambrai Road on the west bank, so that while they could cross in the dry section, it was exceptionally narrow, and then they had to spread out and then move out and fan like a fan, spreading out to a total frontage of 9,700 yards, which would be exceptionally difficult. The plan had the 1st Canadian Division attacking with 2 brigades, and the 4th Canadian Infantry Division with 1 brigade. And the 3rd Division was going to come through to the right of the 4th Division on the eastern side of the village of Bourlon once they got there. And the 1st Division would move left with the 11th British Division attached to the Corps on their left, with the 2nd Canadian Division sitting in reserve. There were 3 objective lines: the red line, which was on the Marquion line, the green line, which was 1,500 yards past it and included the villages of Marquion and Bourlon and ran to the western edge of the wood, and the Blue Line, which was another 2,000 yards further, which ran through the feature called Pilgrim's Rest and La Maisonneuve to the eastern side of Bourlon Wood. The 23rd of September, all daylight movement was suspended in order to hide preparations for the attack, but the Germans could not fail to notice the massive buildup of men, horses, and equipment behind the Canadian lines. They did hold the high ground. There would be no massive pre-attack bombardment this time. In order to maintain surprise, the Canadians decided they would only use a rolling barrage, i.e. firing a barrage that troops to walk behind immediately before the attack, and that was it. The night of the 26th and 27th of September was a very tense night for the troops. They were packed into their assembly areas, 46,000 of them, between the two villages, along with the artillery batteries and machine guns that were going to support them, an inviting target for German artillery. But it began to rain, and now the ground was going to be slippery and mobility a challenge. But thankfully, as the morning broke, the rain stopped. And at 5:20 a.m., the guns of the Canadian Corps opened fire, and the 10th Canadian Brigade began their attack, leading with the 44th Battalion on its right and the 46th Battalion on the left between the village of Inchy and Maneuver. They quickly crossed the canal. Luckily, their crossing point was only 12 feet deep on their side and 5 on the German side, and only about 40 yards wide, and were quickly on the red line, in fact, hitting their timing perfectly. The 11th and 12th Canadian Brigades passed through the 10th and began to drive towards their green line, with the 87th Battalion making it into the southern part of the village of Bourlon by 9:45 in the morning. And they were then passed through by the 54th Battalion, who went around the north end of the woods, making it to the far eastern side. The 102nd Battalion attacked to the south of the wood, but they were forced to defend their right flank because the British division on their right was unable to keep up. When the leading company was halted near Bourlon Wood by an enemy strongpoint, Lieutenant G.T. Lyle executed a flanking movement with his platoon and captured it, together with prisoners and its guns. Later that day, his much weakened platoon was held up by machine guns again at the southern end of the wood. Lieutenant Lyle went forward with his few remaining men, rushed the position single-handed, killed the officer in charge, and took it and his machine gun, capturing many more prisoners. Advancing, he secured his final objective and still more prisoners. On the 1st of October, near Bellecourt, by skillful disposition of the weak company he now commanded, he overcame another strongly held German position, seizing numerous guns and prisoners. In the 2 days, Lieutenant Lyle captured 3 officers, 182 other ranks, 26 machine guns, and 1 field gun, and inflicted heavy losses upon the Germans. He showed throughout the most conspicuous bravery and high powers of command and skillful leadership, and through all of these actions, it led to him being awarded the Victoria Cross. During the fighting, the 54th Battalion was left in exposed positions until the 102nd was finally able to reach the western outskirts of a village called Fontaine Notre Dame by 7 p.m. that night. The 75th and 87th Battalions had come up and were able to secure the line just short of the Blue Line. They were passed through with the 38th and 85th Battalion, and they were able to clear their objectives, but with significant losses. And the 72nd and 78th Battalions were able to secure the Blue Line for the 11th Brigade by 8 p.m. One member of the 78th Battalion, Lieutenant S.L. Honey, who had already won the Distinguished Conduct Medal and the Military Medal as an NCM, took command of his company as all other officers had become casualties. He skillfully reorganized it under very heavy fire. He continued the advance and with great dash gained the objective. Then, finding that his company was suffering casualties from a machine gun, he located the machine gun nest and rushed it by himself, capturing the gun, capturing 10 German prisoners. He then repelled 4 enemy counterattacks and, after dark, went out alone, having located another enemy post, and he led a party to it, which captured it and 3 more guns. Later, on the 29th of September, he led his company against a strong enemy position with great skill and daring, and continued in the succeeding days of battle to display the same high example of valor and self-sacrifice. He died of his wounds received on the 30th of September. He suffered gunshot wounds to the legs during the last day of the attack by his battalion at 12th Canadian Field Ambulance. He won a Victoria Cross for his actions. The 1st Canadian Division began with 2 guns from the 1st Battery Canadian Field Artillery moving in from the town of Inchy and firing directly onto the German frontline positions at just about point-blank range, allowing the 4th Battalion to quickly cross and capture its red line objectives. And the 1st Battalion passed through them and rapidly made their way to the Green Line. And in turn, they were passed through by the 2nd and 3rd Battalions, who at one point were held up from fire from Berlin Wood, but thanks to the 72nd Battalion clearing its objectives and eliminating the problem, the 2 battalions ended the day on the Blue Line. The left-hand company of the 3rd Battalion had Lieutenant G.F. Kerr, who rushed a German strongpoint single-handedly near the Arras-Cambrai road, capturing 4 machine guns and 31 prisoners, and he too won a Victoria Cross. The 2nd Canadian Brigade came through the 1st Brigade and to its left to continue taking the Blue Line, with the 7th Battalion on the Blue Line by 2 in the afternoon, and the 5th Battalion took over and was on the right, an ever-widening front line, capturing the village of Haynecourt, and the 11th British Division came up on its right, continuing to drive north, taking the villages of Epinoy and Oise-le-Verger. The 10th Battalion was next to come forward, and from Haynecourt, and continued to advance, reaching an uncut belt of wire, which they worked to breach, only to find another one that was not known behind it, which was protected by the enemy front line known as the Marconing Line, a 3rd position in the German Hindenburg Line, and they had to dig in and consolidate. The 3rd Brigade had an equally tough task, as they had to clear the Canal du Nord's eastern bank, including the villages of Sains-les-Marquions and Marquions, thus opening up crossing points for units to follow on bridges that were going to be thrown across the canal. The 14th Battalion was given the lead task and quickly captured its first red line objective, including Sains-les-Marquions. The Germans soon recovered from the shock of the crossing and began to cause problems for the 13th and 15th Battalions who came through. The 13th Battalion, the Black Watch, as it moved forward, had lost its tank support, which had been either knocked out or broken down as they were getting to the red line, and it ended up taking both battalions to clear the village of Marquions, and the 15th continued until it reached the Blue Line objectives, securing the village of Souchy-l'Estrée. The day had been a success, even though the units to the south of the Canadian Corps had struggled to keep up. Lieutenant General Arthur Currie ordered the attack to continue through the night and next day in an order to get around to the north side of Cambrai and to prevent the Germans from reforming a defense. The 3rd Canadian Division was ordered to replace the 4th Canadian Division, but this was almost impossible because the units of the 4th Division near the village of Fontaine-Notre-Dame were still under heavy German fire. So the 3rd Division, with its brand new commander, Major General Frederick Loomis, decided that instead of replacing the 4th Division, he would use their line as his start point and attack to clear Fontaine-Notre-Dame and force his way through the Marconing Line. At 6 a.m., the 7th and 9th Canadian Brigades attacked, with the Royal Canadian Regiment making good progress until about 9 o'clock in the morning as they approached the German support trenches. So the PPCLI were pushed up to help them, and by early afternoon, they had overcome the Germans. Lieutenant M.F. Gregg, Military Cross, was awarded the VC for his actions during the attack. He led his men through a small gap in the wire into the German trench where they were counterattacked, and even though he was wounded, went back for more ammunition, was wounded a second time, and continued to lead them as they cleared out the trenches. The 9th Canadian Brigade struggled for success, and while they progressed, it was slow for them to get into the Marconing Line. A deliberate attack planned for 3 that afternoon had to be postponed due to difficulties in getting ammunition to the artillery, and they had to put it off until 7 p.m. With the 7th Brigade attacking beside the 9th, the PPCLI advanced 2,000 yards before running into another unmapped wire belt in front of the Douai-Cambrai road, and fire from the German-held village nearby hammered into them. The 49th Battalion made it to the suburb of Saint-Oly, which is on the Arras-Cambrai road and a suburb of Cambrai, but that was as far as it got. The 9th Brigade's 58th Battalion broke through the defenses between the Arras-Cambrai and the Bapaume-Cambrai roads, being passed through by the 116th Battalion, who also reached Saint-Oly. The 10th Brigade, to the north of the 3rd Canadian Division, cleared the villages of Ralincourt and Sally, but had to pull back from the furthest advance into Sally in the light of heavy casualties, ending the day there. The 1st Division's success on the 27th had them in a salient and farther ahead than the other divisions, and while they delayed their attacks the next day to allow others to catch up, they gained little on the day due to the fierce resistance. The 29th of September was a very similar day, hard fighting for little gain. The 8th Brigade attacks by the 1st and 2nd Canadian Mounted Rifles were held up initially, but then they fought their way into the suburb of Neuville St. Remy, with Captain J. McGregor, who had already won the Military Cross as an officer and his Distinguished Conduct Medal as an other rank, single-handedly attacked a German machine gun nest that was holding up his company, killing 4, capturing 8, and earning the Victoria Cross. The rest of the 3rd Division made slight progress towards the village of Toloy, but were halted by heavy losses and stiff resistance. The 4th Division made no progress, and the 1st Division attack ended where it began, and that day cost Canada 2,089 casualties. The attacks continued on the 30th and began at 6 a.m. And from the start, the 4th Division went wrong with a failed smokescreen, leaving the 75th, 54th, and 87th Battalions unprotected and taking significant losses. The 3rd Division's PPCLI and RCR made progress, but were forced to give ground to keep their hold on the village of Toloy, and because of this, the 1st Canadian and 11th British Divisions could not attack. That afternoon, the Canadian Corps line was shortened, luckily, by the introduction of the British 22nd Corps taking over the northern part of the battlefield. That evening, it began to rain, making things muddy and delaying the delivery of maps, orders, and supplies for the planned next day's attack. The 1st of October at 5 a.m. started with a creeping barrage, and the attack resumed, which led to initial success. On this day, the 1st of October, the Canadian Corps consumed 7,000 tons of artillery ammunition, showing how intense this fighting was. The 1st and 3rd Brigades attacked and made some gains, only to be counterattacked and forced back, losing about 1,000 casualties on this day alone. Sergeant W. Merrifield of the 4th Battalion, attacking near the village of Abincourt, dashed from shell hole to shell hole to attack first one and then another German position, killing all of the occupants. And he was wounded in this action. Refusing to be evacuated, he remained in command of his platoon until he was wounded again, this time extremely badly. He was awarded for the Victoria Cross for his actions. The 11th Division, British Division, made no progress as it tried to aid the 1st Division's lack of success, which in turn hindered the 3rd and 4th Division's operations. The advance on the 1st of October only gained about 1 mile of ground, and all 3 divisions, which had been in action for 5 days, were very worn down. That night, the 2nd Canadian Division came out of Corps Reserve and into the front line, replacing the 4th Division, most of the 3rd Division, and parts of the 1st Division. This action ended, and the Canadians had captured 7,000 prisoners of war, 205 guns, and had broken through the last major defenses leading to Cambrai. So the photos that we have in front of us are all from the battle period. So you notice there's a lot of grass. And the top left-hand photo is engineers of the 4th Division waiting to go into the attack. So these guys are on the Canadian side of the Canal du Nord. So they're waiting to get into the canal and do their job, what the attacking infantry have gone through. Now, the Canadian infantry waiting to go forward at the Canal du Nord there is also believed to be 4th Canadian Division troops, follow-on brigades coming through the Canal du Nord, and you see that it's quite dry. 4th Canadian Division infantry again on the 27th, that's them coming across, so they're across the Canal du Nord at this point, and they're actually moving into the ground. So you can see there's big trees in the background of that photo. It's kind of open ground, there's grass, there's some trenches, but not lots. So it's a very, very different warfare. If you see how they're moving, it's very similar to how modern infantry platoons move today. The other one is one of my favorite photos. It's Bourlon Wood, which is a beautifully big forest. It's a really incredible place. And so those are Canadian infantrymen picking blackberries in the forest after the battle. So you can see how much of this forest was not actually smashed and shattered because it hadn't been fought over. There's another famous photo of a Canadian soldier actually eating blackberries. He did actually survive the war. So where can you visit? Well, for me, the first place you need to go to is Ontario Cemetery. It is on the far bank of the Canal du Nord. And if you stand at Canada Cemetery and you look towards the Canal du Nord, you'll see 2 villages. Those are the villages of Venove and Inchy. So that is, you are standing literally where the Canadian Corps stormed across the Canal du Nord. In the cemetery, there is the commanding officer of the PPCLI, who is a 2-time recipient of the Distinguished Service Order. He was killed in action in the fighting, and there are 6 of his officers with him. It's a really small, beautiful, quiet cemetery on the small French road. Definitely worth visiting. One of my other really kind of favorite cemeteries to visit is Saint-Lô-Marcréant Cemetery. It's in the village of Saint-Lô-Marcréant, and when you come to it, it's this quiet raised cemetery at the intersection in town. There's a great many Canadians in there. It's very peaceful. There's even a couple of veterinary corps guys in there. They were drivers of ambulances, horse ambulances. It's full of Canadians. It's literally a battlefield cemetery. Like, these guys are all buried. And if you see in the photo, the headstones are all touching. They're all close. They're trench graves. So basically, they dug a big hole and laid the men in a row and then buried them that way. So that's why the headstones are so close to each other, because they're practically buried in one big hole. If you're going to this battlefield, not far from Saint-Lô-Marcréant, about a 5 or 8 minute drive, is the Bourlon Wood Canadian Memorial. It's at the top of the hill of Bourlon Wood, and when you stand on this, you can look out and look over all of where the Canadian Corps was standing. It is an absolutely beautiful and magnificent memorial. It's your typical 13-ton granite block that we use for most of our memorials. It's surrounded by a forest of big, massive trees. There's a lot of stairs, just to be forewarned. But it gives you a spectacular view of the battlefield, and it is absolutely beautiful. That photo was taken in March when I was there, so there's not the usual pretty leaves on the trees, but it's really quite beautiful. And not far from here, there's 2 ways to get to it. You can walk from the memorial, or you can drive around the long way and walk through an even muddier trail, is Bourlon Wood Cemetery. So Bourlon Wood Cemetery, has about 200 Canadians. The one thing you notice when you go there is that the first few rows are almost exclusively officers. In fact, 2nd Canadian Mounted Rifles, there's an entire company worth of officers. So company commander, the 2 IC, and all the platoon commanders are buried in the same row from the same rifle company. It's a beautiful cemetery. It's quiet in this wood. It's in somebody's backyard, quite literally. There's 3 members of the Chinese Labor Corps that were killed clearing the battlefield in there as well. So it's one of those cemeteries that is, it's a good place to go and reflect on what happened in this place. Not very big, but it's small. And the other cemetery that I visited that I quite liked was Ennis Cemetery, which is on the Beaupont Cambrai Road. I tripped over it by accident. It's a great cemetery. There's a couple hundred Canadians in there. It's just on the side of the road, and it's where the Canadians were advancing. It's a neat one. There are some other places. The 15th Canadian Battalion has a memorial in Marquillon, Rylancourt Cemetery, and there's a few others that are all over the battlefield that you can actually pop into. Google Maps has them quite well marked. So the Second Battle of Cambrai is what we're going to talk about next, which is the second part of the battle. So the Canadian Corps paused for a week as they reset and refitted for their next battle. But the Allies overall were quite busy. Successive blows against the Germans had been landed at Verdun, Argonne, Saint-Quentin, and in Flanders, all of which had the Germans rushing their reserves from zone to zone without rest or respite. The 1st and 4th Canadian Divisions had been moved into the reserve, with the attached British 11th Division in the very north, the 2nd Canadian Division in the center, and the 3rd Canadian Division in and around Nouvelle Saint-Remy. The next attack was aimed at capturing Cambrai itself, a major logistical hub for the Germans, and crossing the Canal du Nord, or the Scheldt Canal, driving eastwards in support of the British Third Army, who was to the south, who had crossed the Canal du Nord in their sector. The 2nd Canadian Division were to attack over the same ground that had stopped the attack a week before, and so they planned for a silent night attack with the 6th Canadian Brigade attacking Ramillies and the 5th Canadian Brigade to take the village of Marchiones. As part of the attack, the Canadian Corps launched 1,000 drums of phosgene gas into a place called the Bacny Ravine to deny this area to the Germans on the night of the 7th and 8th. They did this because it was an area that the Germans could concentrate. I didn't mention it quite heavily, but mustard gas especially, was used by both sides quite heavily in this battle. The night of the 8th of October was dark, wet, and windy, and the attacking 2nd Canadian Division started at 1:30 in the morning, catching the Germans completely off guard. In fact, catching them as they were being prepared to withdraw and retreat, and started a general withdrawal from the River Oise to the River Scarpe by the Germans. The 27th Battalion captured Ramillies, and by early on the 9th, the 29th and 31st Battalions had found Belcourt, Bacny, and Cullivers completely empty and soon secured them. The 5th Brigade rushed to capture the bridges intact at Pont de Air. The 4th Battalion Canadian Engineers was tasked to prevent the destruction of the main bridge, and led by Captain C.N. Mitchell, and under a heavy barrage, he crossed to the next bridge, where he cut a number of lead wires. In the total darkness and unaware of the position or the strength of the Germans around him, he dashed across the main bridge over the canal. The bridge was found to be heavily wired and set for demolition, and while Captain Mitchell, assisted by one NCO, began cutting the wires, the Germans attempted to rush the bridge and blow the charges. Whereupon he at once dashed to the assistance of his sentry, who had been wounded, and he killed 3 Germans and captured 12, and maintained the bridgehead until he was relieved. And then, under even heavier fire, he continued the task of cutting more wires and removing charges, which he knew could go off at any moment if it had been hit by the enemy. These actions led to him being awarded the Victoria Cross. And soon after, the 25th, 22nd, and 26th Battalions established a bridgehead over the Canal du Nord and cleared the eastern outskirts of Cambrai. The 3rd Division's 4th and 5th Canadian Mounted Rifles crossed the Canal du Nord in Nouvelle Saint-Remy and entered the town of Cambrai proper, finding it the city essentially deserted, except for small German rearguards. The city was in complete ruins, and the Germans had wanted to do more destruction. So while the Canadians worked to prevent more damage and fire from happening, as well as fighting the Germans, they also had to fight the fires that were being deliberately set. Major General Loomis entered Cambrai at 11 a.m., and by midday, the 8th Brigade had cleared to the outskirts of the city. And for the 3rd Canadian Division, it was their 12th day in the front line in a row, and they earned a much-needed rest. The 3rd Canadian Division was pretty much in continuous action for 47 days. That's why they always seem to get beat up. The morning of the 9th of October, air reconnaissance showed that the Germans had started to pull back, blowing bridges as they retreated to slow the attacking Canadians. Except for the occasional shelling, there was nothing to slow down the 2nd Canadian Division advance, clearing more towns and villages. And in one of the very few successful uses of cavalry on the Western Front in the war, the Canadian Light Horse was tasked to seize some high ground near the village of Nave. They got to their first objective, but as they tried to push beyond it, they were stopped, with the loss of 12 men and 47 horses. Soon the advancing infantry came up and stopped as they finally met a serious resistance and heavily wired positions. The 10th of October continued the advance and the clearing of the ground between the Scarpe Canal and the Scheldt Canal, liberating more villages and pushing the Germans back as far as the village of Iwuy. The 2nd Canadian Division then gave up part of their front line to the British 49th West Riding Division, and on the 11th handed over the entire area to the British 22nd Corps. For the Canadian Corps, their time in the front line was done. The battles of Arras, the Scarpe, Arras 1918, the Drocourt-Queant Line, the Canal du Nord, and Cambrai were an impressive 47-day action where the Canadian Corps had advanced a total of 23 miles, captured 18,585 prisoners, 371 artillery pieces, 2,000 machine guns, and had liberated 54 villages and towns, a total of 116 square miles. So the top photo I'm showing you right now is the Canadian infantry actually in the main square of Cambrai, and there's a memorial not far from where this photo was taken to this day for the Canadians, and it looks very similar, except the buildings aren't destroyed. You'll see some Canadian infantry on the bottom left-hand photo, just outside of Cambrai, waiting to go in. The center photo is Brigadier General Victor Odlum of the 11th Canadian Brigade on the Arras-Cambrai Road, giving directions to a Lewis machine gunner, which seems very odd that a brigadier would do that. Beside him is a tank, and anybody who knows anything about tanks will realize that is a French Renault FT-17 tank, but it's missing its cannon. So the Canadians had taken some of these French tanks and assigned them to brigade headquarters and senior officers so they could run around the battlefield in armored protection so they couldn't become casualties, but that they could move from sector to sector quite quickly. So there's a couple of shots of this brigade headquarters moving around with this tank, in fact, and it is actually a Canadian tank. And the bottom other photo is a view of the Cambrai from the Canadian positions in the front line as they're about to attack Cambrai in 1918, October 1918. So where can you visit? Well, there's many places that are worth visiting. Canada Cemetery is a spectacular cemetery outside of Cambrai. There's actually a Second World War Lancaster crew. They're mostly Canadian that are also buried in the cemetery. Their Lancaster went down about a kilometer from there. It is also marked, and the Germans and the local villagers buried them in the same cemetery. My experience with Canada Cemetery is that I was so impressed I was taking my wife there because I found Canada Cemetery. I had to find out my wife and her girlfriends had gone there when they were out shopping for Le Creuset in Belgium. Crest Cemetery is another great cemetery. It's on the battlefield. It's a collection cemetery where they were cleaning up the battlefield and burying the dead as fast as they could. Drummond Cemetery has a great many Canadians. There's also St. Ole Cemetery, Cambrai East Cemetery, Cantemere Cemetery. There's also the Place Astrid Birad, the Cambrai Square. There's also the Cambrai Canadian Memorial, which you see in the photo here. Naves Communal Cemetery Extension, Wellington Cemetery, Uwe Cemetery, and I'm going to mention Niagara Cemetery as well, because that is where Lieutenant W.L. Algie from the 20th Battalion, who died at the very end of the battle, is commemorated today. And I've actually been there. It's another beautiful cemetery. While Canada had done a great deal and had shattered the German lines, these great strategic victories had cost Canada a significant loss, with 1,544 officers and 29,262 other ranks becoming casualties in the course of the battle. The Canadian Bourlon Wood Memorial is the last of the 8 memorials given to Canada for its participation in the Great War. It sits atop the hill of Bourlon Wood, overlooking, and is very calm and peaceful. Thank you very much. I hope you really enjoyed this talk on the Battle of the Canal du Nord and Cambrai.